So we're selecting that page element with the class of output and generating a grid from it, and then also making it dynamic the way that we're creating the grid so that we can create an element on the fly when JavaScript and add a grid to that one as well. So that's why we've got the two grids there. We've got the grid set for 5 by 5. So this is updatable, so you can change the number of rows, you can change the number of columns, and that was going to affect both of the grids and the number of elements that are displayed within the grids. These elements are all interactive, so you can click them, and whatever the color of the element is, it's going to update the background of the page to that same color. There's also a couple buttons here at the top that we're also creating using JavaScript, and what they do is they provide us a way to loop through all of the page elements that we've created and update the background colors of them. So this is just randomizing the colors, and the reason that we have two buttons there is because there's going to be two ways that we're going to be showing you how you can select the elements. So one is going to be using the query selector all, and the second way is just creating a holder that's going to hold all of the elements within an array, and then you can loop through that array anytime to access the page elements. And then selecting them, they're all interactive, and they all have that click event that's going to update their color to the background color of the page. So that's all going to be covered in this lesson. Start by selecting the page element where you want to add the grid into, and then going into the code. So we've selected the element with a class of output, and this is where we're going to build our grid. So we need to set some parameters for the grid, and I'm just going to create an object, call it grid, and within the grid object we'll have a value for rows and also a value for columns. And so we can dynamically change the value for rows and the value of columns, and this will automatically update the grid that we're outputting. So we're going to be constructing the grid all using JavaScript code and using this object values in order to select the grid. So we also want to calculate out the total, and the total for the grid, the number of cells that we're going to be creating, and keeping it dynamic. So we're selecting the object value for rows and then multiplying it by the grid value for columns. So that will give us the number of actual elements that we're creating for the page. We're going to create 40 items in this case because it's 5 times 8. And we'll create a function, create grid, and we'll invoke the function. So create that function, create grid, and we'll pass in the value of total. So again, it can be dynamic, and we can have multiple grids that we can create depending on what we're setting up for the total itself. And now within the create the grid, we want to create several elements. So using the for loop, so let I equals 0, and we'll continue the loop while I is less than the value for total. And then the value of I is going to increment by 1. Create those elements. So if we want to create an element, we can use the document create element, and then the type of element that we want to create, and where we want to append. So the parent will get the element that we are creating, and using the append method that we did in the previous lesson, we'll create that and append the element that we just created. Also, we can add some values to those elements. So let's see what happens here. And then within the output, let's add within the text content, and I'm using the backticks for the template literals. So we're going to set up a value of I plus 1. And this will represent the elements that we're adding to the page. And let's see what happened within the elements what we've got within output, and we've simply got the value of 40. That's because the text content is overriding, so let's update that element. And now that will give us all 40 divs onto the page that we can then use in order to format. Let's add in some classes to those page elements. And I'm going to create styling directly within the HTML tags and create an element, a class called box. So set this to have a border and one pick, solid border, and make it a slightly grayish color. So applying to these elements. So what we've got with the elements, and then using class list, we can add a class. So we need the string value of the class that we want to add. So it's going to apply that class to the page elements. And also let's do a text align. So center align the text, and that adds in all of the elements. And also for output, let's apply the display property, and we're going to be using the CSSGrid. So set the display as grid. And then for the width, I'm going to use the 80 viewport width, and then set the margin, and this should be margin, to auto, so that will center that main parent element. So if we want to set the properties as we've created them within the create grid, once the elements are created, then we can update the grid style property by calculating the number of rows that we want for the column rows. So within the output, and that's going to be just referring to the parent, style, and the style, we're going to set a property. And the property that we're setting is going to be the grid template columns, and this is how you can set with the CSS grid that different values, and this is going to repeat, and the repeat options are going to be whatever the value that we've got for the number of columns. So whatever we've got for grid columns is what we want to repeat by. I'm going to update these to be the backticks, and I'll update these ones as well so that we can have consistency within the styling. So let's set this up, and this is going to be our grid columns value. And then let's comma separate it and use 1FR for the rows across. So that gives us a dynamically generated grid that as we update, will also update on the page. By setting those properties to the parent element, and that's adding it within the style property, we're setting it and dynamically adjusting it with JavaScript. So now let's apply some styling, and up to the element, we'll select a style and set the background color. I'm going to just do a random background. So I'll create a function that's going to generate a random background. And let's create that function. So what we want this function to do is to return back a random background color. So we want to return back a random hex value. So do a return, and using the hash. And then let's add to that, we're going to use the math random method and use that, converting it to string, and using a base 16, so it's going to return it back as a hex value. And what we want is we want to just get the substring, so we're going to subtract and return back only the last 6 characters. So let's see how that works. So that gives us a set of random colors. We can also make these elements clickable as well. And to make the code a little bit more readable, we're going to create a function that will make the element. We'll just call it maker. And for this function, we're going to do all of the creation of the page elements within this maker function. So let's copy what we've got here. And the result will be that we're going to return back the element. So in case we do need to use it, as we're looping through, we can return back that element with the maker. And in order to do the return, let's do an append child to output. So that will return back the page elements on the screen. And it looks like we're throwing an error. And the reason that I is not defined, so we need to pass in that value of I into maker. And let's see what happens. So we get the output there. And also to make it more dynamic, so if we want to set a parent object that we want to add the grid to, so let's add that, and that's going to be the output element. And we need to also pass the parent into maker, and the parent is going to be referring to the output element. So nothing should change with our code, but this is just making it more flexible and dynamic in case we want to create another element and add another grid to that element. And we also need to pass in, so we've got one other value, and that's going to be the grid columns. So that's going to be the dynamic value, so it's just columns. And here we're going to reference it to the grid columns. So that will give us how many columns across. And once again, we shouldn't see any change. Let's create another element on the fly. So we'll call this one output 1. And using the document, we're going to create an element. The element that we're creating is going to be a div. And for this div, so using the document body, and we're going to append the output 1 to the div, to the document object. So going into the elements, we can actually prepend it. So we've got that element that we just created. So that's going to be output 1 there. And let's see if we can create a second grid. And instead of output, we're going to send it over to output 1. And that gives us a second grid, but we're not applying the properties to the parent. So we have an option here where we can add the output class to that element. So it's another thing that we need to do, where we've got the output 1, and then using the class list, let's add the class of output. So that will apply the properties that we need for the grid itself. And then let's double check the element. And I think we're hard coding down to the parent. So let's fix that and make it completely dynamic. So this way we can generate 2 grids. And for the output 1, update the style, margin, bottom value there, so we can distinguish between the two. So that generates a couple page elements that have a whole listing of elements in them. So let's make them a little bit more dynamic, where the elements on the page, make them clickable. And we can do this as a separate. We'll add an event listener, and the event is going to be click. And we'll run a function called update back. And within this function, so the update back function will get the color value of the element. So passing in the event object, and let's set it up as the element. So the element within the event object target. And for now, we'll take the console log and take the elements and get its style background color value. So when we click those elements, we're getting the background color, and it's returning it back within RGB. So we can use that to take the document body style, and let's set the background color. So this will dynamically update the background color to whatever we've got for this property value. So now clicking them is going to update the background color of the document body. And this produces a really dynamic way to generate some page elements and then also make them interactive with the parent content, or the cursor to be grab. So that way as we hover over them, they're going to look a little bit more clickable. And because these are elements on the page, maybe we want to also just have a way to update the background colors of all of the elements. So as we're adding them to the page, when we're adding the elements, when we're creating them, let's create an array that's going to hold all of the page elements. So do an array that we can add to the page elements as we're creating them. So within holder, we're going to push the element objects into it. So going into the console, if we output the holder array, that's going to return back all of the page elements. And because they're within the array, this is going to make it really easy to select the elements. And you could also use the query selector and select via the class. So there's a couple options there. So whatever works best for you. So I want to add in another element button. Or I want to add in a first element button, and that's going to be using the document create element and creating a button for the page. And this is going to just update the colors for the page elements. So take the button one, add the event listener to button one. So if it does get clicked, and here we can loop through all of the elements in holder. So just have holder before, so it's declared. So holder, and then for each. And this is going to actually return back each one of the elements. So here we can select and we can update the background color. So just as we set the background color for the element, we can do a full update of all of the background colors. And we need to still add the button to the page. So just as we did with the document body, let's prepend the button, but we're going to do it after the output one. So that button will be sitting above there. Let's add in some text content, colors, and clicking that will set all of the colors to random. So it looks like we threw an error there, and the reason that L was not set, so it's looking for a value for L. So when it gets clicked, it will loop through all of the elements that we have within the holder array, and it'll allow us to update them. Let's add in another button. And so this will be the button 2 and random colors. And this will just demonstrate a second way where we're still adding the event listener, but this event listener is going to select the elements from the page. So we're not going to be using all of the holder one. We'll be selecting all of the elements, and we can do this using the document query selector. So now that they've been added into the DOM, you can select the elements of the class of box, and then we can loop through each one of them using the for each. And this part of the function can be the exact same, where we can update the background colors. So this is just going to be another way that you don't need to use a holder. So in some cases you might need to reference all of the elements, so it's just going to make it easy to do. But again, it's up to you and the way that you're presenting your coding, what you might want to do with it. So adding in that second button. So they're both going to produce the same result. And just to distinguish between them. So we have a 2 and a 1. And maybe it looks a little bit better if we're adding the 2 first, and then we'll add the 1. So there we go. So we've got a way to randomly generate the elements, select the elements, make them interactive on the page, and then also update those elements in place. And that's all done with JavaScript dynamically. And one other item that I want to do, so let's move out and move these buttons to center the buttons in order to make it look a little bit better. and we'll create an output area. So again, creating another element. So we've got lots of practice creating elements, and then adding this one to the top, and then we're going to add the buttons into that element. So instead of, we'll append it into output 2, and then output 2 will be prepended. And these can actually be append, so it's not actually going to matter. And then we'll apply some styling to those to center that element. So we've got the output 2. And this is more just to practice getting more familiar with what you can do with JavaScript. And output 2. Also going to select and apply a style. So border, so that we can see the contents. And we want to center the element contents. So we can center output 2 by a style and set its width. And so the max width, maybe we want to set it to 80%. So that will center. And then also for the output 2, let's center the content using the style, text, align. And in order to get the property names, they're typically going to be camel cased. So that's going to be the uppercase. So they're not using the dashes, it's using the camel case for the property names. So for text align, and we'll center align the text. And that will center the buttons. And you can also add in some padding. And of course, you can apply the styling the same way with CSS. But we did want to practice some JavaScript, so this will give us a good opportunity to update the styling of that output element. And now that we've updated it, let's make the border slightly lighter. And then one last one, so that we have some margin for the element. And we can actually, instead of auto, we'll just keep the auto for right and left. And then top and bottom will have a margin of 10 pixels. So that concludes our generating the page elements, making them interactive on the screen, and then also updating and creating a grid, all using JavaScript.